I am Jarvis, your storyteller. Welcome to the Science Fiction Exploration. If you like the story, please subscribe to our channel.
The Unexpected Guardian. The ancient dragon Dracorath soared above the storm-ravaged coastline, his obsidian scales glinting like polished black glass against flashes of lightning. He had lived for centuries, witnessing the rise and fall of human kingdoms with detached indifference. Humans were fleeting creatures, their lives as brief as mayflies compared to dragonkind. They were also, in his experience, troublesome, always building where they shouldn't, always warring amongst themselves, always hunting what they feared. Tonight, however, was not about humans. It was about the raw power of nature, a magnificent tempest that called to his primordial being. The hurricane had swept in from the eastern seas with unprecedented fury, sending humans scurrying for shelter. Dracorath reveled in the chaotic energy, riding thermal currents and diving through rain sheets that would have blinded lesser creatures. The dragon's keen eyes spotted something unusual among the wreckage of a coastal village, a faint pulsing light, barely visible through the storm. Curiosity, that most dangerous of draconic traits, pulled him downward in a tight spiral. Landing with surprising grace for a creature of his size, Dracorath folded his massive wings and investigated the strange glow. The source was a small stone structure, partially collapsed but somehow still standing while buildings around it had been completely destroyed. The light emanated from within, steady and unwavering despite the chaos surrounding it. Using one massive claw, Dracorath carefully peeled away the rubble. Inside, protected by what remained of the structure, lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth that shimmered with faint protective runes. A human infant, impossibly tiny and fragile, slept peacefully within, unaware of the destruction around it or the enormous predator now staring down at it with golden eyes. Dracorath rumbled low in his throat. By all rights, he should leave the creature to its fate. Dragons did not meddle in human affairs. It was the first law of his kind, established after the Great Burning when humans had hunted dragons nearly to extinction. And yet, the infant's eyes opened, deep violet, unusual for a human, and locked onto Dracorath's gaze without fear. Then it did something no sensible creature should do when confronted by a dragon, it smiled and reached upward with tiny fingers. "Foolish little one," Dracorath growled, his voice like distant thunder. "You should tremble before me." The baby gurgled and continued reaching, the protective magic around it pulsing brighter. Dracorath lowered his massive head for a closer look and found himself unexpectedly touched by one tiny hand. A jolt of something, not quite magic, not quite physical, passed between them. The dragon reared back, startled. In that brief contact, he had sensed something extraordinary. This was no ordinary human child. Whatever it was, whatever power it contained, it called to him in ways he couldn't explain. The storm worsened, water now rushing through the streets. Soon, even this partial shelter would not protect the infant. "I must be losing my mind," Dracorath muttered, carefully lifting the bundle with his foredolin. "Elder Scale will never let me hear the end of this." With the infant secure, he launched skyward, powerful wings beating against the hurricane winds. The journey to his mountain sanctuary took hours, the storm fighting him at every turn. By the time the familiar peaks came into view, even Dracorath's immense strength was waning. The child, remarkably, had slept through most of the flight, waking only occasionally to stare up at its unlikely savior. The sanctuary was a vast network of caves, hidden behind an illusion that made the mountainside appear solid. Dracorath passed through the magical barrier and into the cavernous main chamber, where ancient treasures lined the walls and a permanent magical fire burned in the center, providing warmth and light. "Now what?" he asked the infant, who had begun to fuss. Dracorath had no knowledge of caring for human young. Dragons hatched fully formed, needing only guidance, not nurturing. This creature would require food, cleaning, protection, for years. "I should take you to a human settlement," he decided, though the nearest one was days away by flight. "You don't belong here." The baby began to cry in earnest now, its face scrunching up in distress. The sound echoed painfully in the cavern, assaulting Dracaratha's sensitive ears. "Stop that," he commanded, to no effect. The wailing continued, growing more insistent. Dracarath closed his eyes, focusing on memories from centuries of observing humans. They fed their young with milk, he recalled. He had none to offer. What he did have was magic. Concentrating, he conjured a small cloud above his forepaw that began to rain droplets of a milky substance. He carefully collected some in a small golden bowl from his treasure hoard and, with extreme delicacy, offered it to the infant. To his relief, the child drank eagerly, violet eyes watching him intently the entire time. When finished, the infant yawned and drifted back to sleep, nestled against the warmth of Dracaratha's scales. One night, the dragon said firmly, "Tomorrow I find your kind." Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Each morning, Dracarath would tell himself today was the day he would deliver the child, whom he had reluctantly named Lyra after the constellation visible the night he found her, to humans. Each evening, he would find a reason to delay. The truth, though he was loath to admit it, was that Lyra fascinated him. She grew quickly, as humans do, each day bringing new developments. Her first words were in Draconic, not human tongue. Her first steps were taken on the smooth stone floors of his treasure chamber. When she laughed, small sparks of magic sometimes danced around her fingertips, definitely not typical of human children. On Lyra's third birthday by Dracaratha's reckoning, trouble arrived in the form of Elder Scale, ancient matriarch of the Dragon Council. Her massive copper form filled the entrance to Dracaratha's sanctuary, her expression one of disbelief as she observed the human child playing contentedly among priceless artifacts. "Have you lost your mind, Dracarath?" she demanded, her voice causing stalagmites to vibrate. "A human? In our realm?" Lyra, showing none of the fear a sensible being should display, toddled over to the newcomer and offered her most prized possession, a small crystal that caught and refracted light in beautiful patterns. "For you," she said in perfect Draconic. "Pretty like your scales." Elder Scale blinked, momentarily disarmed. "It speaks our tongue." "Her name is Lyra," Dracarath said defensively. "And yes, she speaks many tongues now. She learns faster than any human I've observed." "You've broken our most sacred law," Elder Scale recovered her stern demeanor. "Humans and dragons must remain separate. The council will demand her removal or worse." Dracarath moved protectively closer to Lyra. "She is under my protection. You cannot protect her from the entire council." "Then I shall leave the council lands," Dracarath declared, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "There are places even we have not explored, beyond the western void." Elder Scale studied him, then the child. "There is something unusual about this human." "Yes. The protective magic around her when you found her, describe it again." Dracarath did so, watching as Elder Scale's expression shifted from outrage to thoughtfulness. "The runes you saw. Were they perhaps in the old script?" she asked. "They might have been. I didn't study them closely in the storm." Elder Scale sighed, a sound like wind through ancient ruins. "There is an old prophecy, largely dismissed as nonsense, about a bridge between our kinds. A human child marked by magic, raised by dragons." She fixed her gaze on Lyra, who had returned to her play. "I must consult the archives." "Does this mean you won't report us to the council?" Dracarath asked. "Not yet," Elder Scale conceded. "But be vigilant, Dracarath. If this child is what I suspect, there are those who would destroy her rather than see our worlds reconnected." After Elder Scale departed, Dracarath watched Lyra with new concern. He had saved her on impulse, raised her out of curiosity, but now it seemed she might be something more, a pivotal figure in Dragonkind's future. That night, as Lyra slept curled against his warm scales, Dracarath made a decision. He would not just protect her, he would prepare her. If a storm was coming, she would need to be ready. Sleep well, little one, he rumbled softly. Tomorrow, your real education begins. And so it did. Over the following years, Dracorath taught Lyra everything he knew, the languages of all intelligent species, the complex history of dragons and humans, magic in its many forms, combat both physical and magical. Lyra absorbed it all with astonishing speed, her violet eyes often glowing faintly during particularly intense lessons. By her 10th year, she could conjure fire, though nowhere near as hot as a dragon's, understand the speech of animals, and defend herself against opponents many times her size using a combination of agility and magical deflection. On her 12th birthday, Elder Scale returned, this time accompanied by Noctis, the shadow dragon and keeper of dragon prophecies. The old black dragon circled Lyra carefully, his ancient eyes narrowed in concentration. "Show me your palm, child," he requested. Lyra did so without hesitation. Noctis studied the lines there, then nodded gravely. "It is as I suspected," he announced. "She bears the mark of convergence." "What does that mean?" Dracorath demanded. "It means," Elder Scale said solemnly, "that whether we like it or not, the age of separation is ending. Humans and dragons will once again share knowledge, for better or worse." "And Lyra?" Dracorath pressed. "She stands at the center of it all," Noctis replied. "The human raised by dragons, the bridge between worlds." Lyra looked between the ancient dragons, then up at Dracorath, her guardian, her teacher, her family. "I'm ready," she said with a confidence that belied her years. Dracorath wasn't nearly as certain, but he had learned long ago not to underestimate this remarkable human who had changed everything. The coming storm would test them all. The world between worlds. 5 years had passed since Lyra learned of her destiny as the bridge between dragons and humankind. Now 17, she stood at the entrance of the Great Dragon Conclave, a massive underground chamber where dragons from all territories gathered once a century. By Dracorath's side, she looked remarkably composed for the only human in a sea of ancient, powerful beings who could incinerate her with a single breath. "Remember," Dracorath murmured, "speak only when addressed directly. Some here are not as accepting as Elder Scale and I have become." Lyra nodded slightly, her violet eyes scanning the chamber. Over 50 dragons of various sizes, colors, and ages filled the space, their scales reflecting the light of magical fires that burned along the walls. Many were already watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. "The human should not be here," rumbled Pyrock, a massive red dragon known for his temper. "This is a sacred gathering." "She is here by my invitation," Elder Scale responded, her copper scales gleaming as she took her place at the head of the assembly. "And by ancient right, as the Marked One." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. The Marked One, a figure of prophecy, dismissed by many as myth. "Preposterous," spat Vextra, an emerald dragon known for her conservative views. "Humans are dangerous, unpredictable. Have you forgotten the Great Burning? How they hunted us nearly to extinction?" "That was 1,000 years ago," Dracorath countered. "Perhaps it's time for new understanding." "Understanding?" Vextra's laugh was like grinding stone. "They multiply like insects, destroy forests for their dwellings, pollute waters with their wastes. What is there to understand?" Lyra stepped forward, despite Dracorath's warning glance. "With respect, Elder Vextra," she said in flawless Draconic, "I believe there is much our kinds could learn from each other, if given the chance." "The human speaks," Noctis observed dryly. "And with more wisdom than some who have lived centuries." Before Vextra could retort, the ground beneath them trembled violently. Dust and small stones rained from the cavern ceiling as the tremor intensified. Dragons, despite their size, maintained their balance with practiced ease. Lyra stumbled but remained upright, her hand instinctively reaching for the crystal pendant around her neck, a gift from Dracorath on her 16th birthday, infused with protective magic. "The void stirs," announced Corenthal, a silver dragon and the conclave's chief seer. Her eyes had gone milky white, seeing beyond the physical realm. The devourer awakens after millennia of slumber. The chamber fell silent. Even Vextra looked shaken. What is the devourer? Lyra whispered to Dracorath. A creature of legend, he replied quietly. Said to feed on magic itself. The ancient texts claim it nearly destroyed both dragons and humans before it was sealed away in the void between worlds. Corenthal's blind gaze fixed on Lyra. The seal weakens. The balance shifts. Human magic and dragon fire once combined to create the prison. Only together can they reinforce it. Another tremor shook the chamber, stronger this time. A crack appeared in the western wall, radiating darkness rather than revealing stone behind it. It comes, Corenthal whispered, then collapsed. Through the growing rift, something moved, something that seemed to bend light around it, a presence more felt than seen. Cold dread washed over the assembly as the crack widened. We must evacuate, Elder Scale commanded. Scatter to the cardinal sanctuaries. The ancient protocols must be followed. Dragons began moving toward the various exits, their earlier disagreements forgotten in the face of a common threat. Dracorath nudged Lyra toward the eastern passage. Go with Noctis, he ordered. The eastern sanctuary is the most defensible. What about you? Lyra demanded. I will help Elder Scale seal this chamber. We cannot allow the devourer to follow. Lyra's eyes flashed. I'm not leaving you. This isn't a discussion, Lyra. For once in your life, do as you're told. Dracorath rarely raised his voice to her, and the sharp tone made her flinch. Noctis intervened. Child, your guardian speaks wisdom. Come. Reluctantly, Lyra followed Noctis and several other dragons through the eastern passage. As they fled, she glanced back to see Dracorath and Elder Scale facing the growing rift, ancient magic gathering around them like storm clouds. The eastern sanctuary, located beneath a mountain range hundreds of miles from the conclave site, was a vast complex of caves and chambers filled with the accumulated knowledge of dragonkind. Under different circumstances, Lyra would have been fascinated by the scrolls, artifacts, and crystalline memory repositories that lined the walls. Now, she paced anxiously, waiting for news of Dracorath. Your concern for him is admirable, Noctis observed, watching her from across the central chamber. But pacing solves nothing. We should be doing something, Lyra insisted. Corenthal said both human and dragon magic would be needed to seal the devourer away again. And what would you have us do? You are but one human, and an untested one at that. I'm the marked one, she countered. Whatever that means, it must be useful for something beyond causing arguments at dragon meetings. Noctis chuckled, a sound like distant thunder. Your spirit reminds me of Dracorath in his younger days. Always challenging, always questioning. A younger bronze dragon named Terrace approached, bowing slightly to Noctis. Elder, the communication crystals have activated. Elder Scale requests your presence in the scrying chamber. Lyra followed without invitation, ignoring Terrace's disapproving glance. In the scrying chamber, a large crystal pulsed with copper light, Elder Scale's magical signature. The initial seal holds, but barely, Elder Scale's voice emerged from the crystal. Dracorath is wounded but alive. The devourer is stronger than the records indicated. What is your assessment? Noctis asked. The prophecy speaks truth. We need the combined power of dragons and humans to reinforce the seal permanently. One human alone cannot channel sufficient power. Lyra stepped forward. Then I need to go back to human lands. Absolutely not, came Dracorath's voice, weaker than usual but still authoritative. It's too dangerous. It's necessary, Lyra insisted. I've spent my life learning your ways, your magic. Now I need to reconnect with my own kind, convince them to help. Silence filled the chamber as the dragons considered her words. "The child speaks truth," Noctis finally said. "The prophecy has always been clear, the marked one would bridge our worlds in time of greatest need." "The humans will never trust her," Terrace objected. "She reeks of dragon magic. They'll see her as a threat." "Perhaps," Elder Scale conceded. "But we have no alternative. The seal will fail completely within a lunar cycle." After much debate, a plan was formed. Lyra would travel to Stormhaven, the nearest human city, accompanied by Terrace in human form. Dragons rarely used this ability, considering it demeaning to assume the shape of a lesser species, but Terrace was young enough to be flexible in his thinking. Before departing, Lyra visited the sanctuary's armory, where she selected a slender sword forged with dragon fire. Its blade held a faint violet glow that matched her eyes. "It suits you," said a familiar voice. Dracarath had arrived, one wing bandaged tightly against his body, several scales missing from his neck. "You should be resting," Lyra chided, rushing to his side. "And miss sending you on your first diplomatic mission?" "Never." His tone was light, but his eyes betrayed his concern. "Lyra, human society is complicated. They don't think as we do." "I know. You've taught me their history, their languages. Books and lessons are not experience." Dracarath sighed, a warm current of air that ruffled Lyra's dark hair. "Your appearance alone will raise questions. A human raised by dragons is unprecedented in living memory." Lyra touched the scaled pattern that had appeared on her arms over the years, a physical manifestation of her dragon upbringing. "I'll find a way. I always do." Dracarath nuzzled her gently, a rare display of physical affection. "Yes, you always do." Stormhaven proved to be overwhelming. After a lifetime in dragon sanctuaries, Lyra found the press of humanity disorienting, thousands of people packed into streets barely wide enough for a medium-sized dragon to navigate. The noise, the smells, the constant movement assaulted her senses. Terrace, now appearing as a tall, bronze-skinned human male, seemed equally uncomfortable. "How do they stand being so close to each other?" he muttered. "Focus," Lyra reminded him. "We need to find the Guild of Mages. According to Noctis, they're the only humans who might still remember the old alliance." The guild proved difficult to locate. Most citizens they questioned either didn't know of its existence or claimed it was merely a myth. Eventually, they found themselves in Stormhaven's oldest district, before a nondescript building with a faded sign bearing a complex magical sigil. "This is it," Lyra breathed, recognizing the symbol from Dracarath's teachings. The guild's mark. Inside, they found not the grand magical institution of legend, but a dusty bookshop attended by a single elderly woman. She looked up as they entered, her rheumy eyes widening with shock as she took in Lyra's appearance. "By the old powers," she whispered. A dragon touched. Lyra stepped forward. "My name is Lyra. I seek the Guild of Mages on a matter of great urgency." The woman laughed bitterly. "The Guild? It's been generations since any true magic was practiced openly among humans. Now we have parlor tricks and charlatans." She studied Lyra more closely. "Yet here you stand, practically glowing with the old power. Where did you come from, child?" "She was raised by dragons," Terrace said bluntly, his patience wearing thin. "And we need human mages to help seal away the devourer before it destroys both our kinds." "Dragons?" The woman's voice rose sharply. "The devourer? Such things are bedtime stories now, nothing more." "They are very real," Lyra insisted. "And if we don't act quickly, they'll be the last stories anyone tells." Something in Lyra's tone made the woman pause. She moved to the back of the shop and pulled a hidden lever. A section of bookshelf swung outward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Follow me," she said. "If what you say is true, there are people who need to hear it." The underground chamber was surprisingly large, illuminated by soft magical light. Around 20 people of varying ages sat in a circle, expressions ranging from skepticism to awe as the shopkeeper introduced Lyra and explained her story. "Preposterous," said an older man in elaborate robes. "Dragons are extinct, hunted to death centuries ago." "Then you are poorly informed, Master Thorn," replied an elegant woman with silver-streaked hair. "The dragons simply withdrew from our world after the Great Burning. Some of us have maintained contact, however limited." This woman, Magister Isolde, proved to be Lyra's strongest ally in the days that followed. As head of what remained of the true Guild of Mages, she helped arrange a larger gathering of those humans who still practiced the old magics. "It won't be many," she warned. "Perhaps 50 across the entire region. Not like the old days when thousands of mages stood alongside dragonkind against the Devourer." "Will it be enough?" Terrace asked. Isolde's expression was grim. "We must make it enough." While Isolde gathered her forces, Lyra and Terrace searched the guild's ancient archives for any information that might help strengthen the seal. Deep in the oldest section, they discovered a journal written in a dual script of human runes and draconic symbols. This belonged to Viridian, the first marked one, Lyra realized, carefully turning the fragile pages. "The one who helped create the original seal. Does it say how?" Terrace leaned closer. Lyra's finger traced the faded text. "It says the Devourer cannot be destroyed, only contained. Its prison requires constant vigilance, powered by what?" Lyra looked up, her face pale. "By sacrifice. Viridian gave her life force to create the original seal, binding her essence between worlds to keep the Devourer contained." The implication hung heavy between them. As the new marked one, would Lyra have to make the same sacrifice? When the day came to return to the Dragon Sanctuary, 43 human mages accompanied Lyra and Terrace. Most had never seen a dragon before, and their awe was palpable when they entered the Eastern Sanctuary and found themselves surrounded by beings they had believed mythical. Dracaratha's pride was evident as he watched Lyra explain the plan to the combined forces of dragons and humans. She stood confident, articulate, equally at home with both species, truly the bridge the prophecy had promised. What she had not told anyone, not even Dracarath, was what she had learned from Viridian's journal. The plan she outlined would strengthen the seal temporarily, buying them years, perhaps decades. But she knew a permanent solution would require more. As the combined magical ritual began, power flowed between human and dragon in ways not seen for a millennium. The rift, which had grown to threaten multiple sanctuaries, began to shrink under their combined assault. Then, at the critical moment, Lyra broke from the circle and approached the rift directly, her crystal pendant glowing blindingly bright. "Lyra, no!" Dracarath roared, sensing her intent. "It's the only way," she called back. "A temporary seal will fail eventually. You taught me that sometimes the hardest choice is the only right one." Before anyone could stop her, Lyra pressed her hands against the edges of the rift. Violet energy exploded outward as her life force began to merge with the magical barrier, her physical form becoming translucent. In desperation, Dracarath lunged forward, wrapping his massive form around her. "Not alone," he growled. "Never alone." Something unexpected happened then, a resonance between their magics, amplified by the bond they had formed over 17 years. Instead of either being consumed, the energy stabilized, creating a new kind of seal, one powered not by sacrifice but by connection. The rift closed completely, leaving Lyra and Dracarath exhausted but alive, surrounded by astonished dragons and humans. "Impossible," whispered Corenthal, her seer's eyes wide. "The prophecy spoke of sacrifice." "Perhaps," Noctis said thoughtfully, "we misinterpreted. The sacrifice was not of life, but of separation. Dragon and human, forever connected." In the days that followed, a new council formed, dragons and humans working together for the first time in a millennium. Lyra and Dracorath took central roles, their unique bond a living symbol of what could be achieved through cooperation. The world was changing. Old hatreds and fears were not easily overcome, but a beginning had been made. As for the Devourer, it remained sealed away, though Lyra sometimes felt its distant rage in her dreams. "Do you regret it?" she asked Dracorath one evening as they watched the sunset from his mountain peak. "Rescuing me all those years ago?" The ancient dragon considered for a moment, then rumbled softly, "I have regretted many things in my long life, little one. That decision was never among them." Lyra smiled, leaning against his warm scales. Dragon and human, guardian and ward, two beings from different worlds who had somehow forged a connection strong enough to save them both. And somewhere in the space between worlds, the Devourer raged against its prison, unable to break the bonds forged by something it could never understand, the power of an unexpected family, found in the most unlikely of circumstances.